Andrew Fox served 16 years in the British Army, fought in Afghanistan, and now he's exposing how Hamas inflated Gaza's death toll and how the media helped spread the lie. Watch the full breakdown and tell us in the comments below. Were you fooled too?
What we found looking into the Hamas fatality statistics from Gaza, however, is that there is enough data manipulation in there to raise real concerns. So things we found, we can give you examples of people who are listed as being killed by IDF action, who've gone into Israel to receive cancer treatment. We've found people that died in 2014 and 2022. We've also found a real trend of reducing the ages of people on those lists to drag them down from being 18-year-olds to being 17-year-olds and therefore children. And so our key finding is that when you're presented with breakdowns of men, women and children killed, these are almost certainly unreliable.
Do you think that there is enough, that the death toll is large enough for this to be classified in any way, shape or form as a genocide? Perhaps the beginning of a genocide?
No, not at all. And there's a number of key reasons for that. First of all is the amount of munition dropped in Gaza. There's almost, I think it's 2 tons for every civilian killed, which either suggests one of two things. Either it's the IDF attempting a genocide and being the least accurate shots in history, or it's that they are following a proper targeting process and hitting targets that are legitimate and proportionate military targets. And the main reason that the civilian death count is so low is that in the areas where the IDF are fighting, there are no civilians, or indeed very few civilians. And that's because the IDF has taken unprecedented measures to evacuate civilians from the area. And critics of Israel can't have it both ways. They can't publish the images of civilians evacuating from these areas and claim that is somehow part of a humanitarian disaster, and then at the same time claim that civilians are dying in genocide level figures. It's one or the other. Of course, humanitarian situation such as we have in Gaza is extremely challenging for those civilians, and we must consider those poor Gazans who are innocent and sat in al-Mawasi humanitarian camp with their homes destroyed and their personal possessions limited to what they can carry. But that doesn't make it a genocide.
There's a lot of talk about proportionality. If you look at social media, critics of Israel will very often say the response is not proportional. What is proportionality as defined in military law?
You can't look at the conflict in its entirety and look at the effects of the conflict to make any assessment of proportionality whatsoever. The important thing to note about proportionality is that it has to be assessed on a strike-by-strike, action-by-action basis. And the simple question is this: is the target struck worth the number of civilian or other collateral damage inflicted by that airstrike? So, for example, had they used an airstrike on Sinwar, they could have justified a large amount of munitions. And that's what they were able to do with Mohammed Daif, who was Sinwar's number 2. He was killed in a huge airstrike with a number of 2,000-pound bombs and a bunker-busting bomb used. And there was significant collateral damage in that airstrike. But it was Hamas's number 2. You could justify a huge amount of damage to take out a target of that exceptional military value. If that had been a lone Hamas gunman, you couldn't have justified that whatsoever. And so proportionality, you can't look at the entirety of the conflict. You have to look at each individual airstrike and say, was that justified against the amount of damage it caused?
In terms of the reports, what are the main sources that you analyzed when you did this report on the Gaza death toll? What are the sources aside from the Gaza Ministry of Health?
So there are 2 main sources of casualty figures from Gaza. There's the Gaza Ministry of Health and there's the government media office in Gaza. And we've tried to focus on their documentation because actually there's a load of reports and there's loads of people who've looked at these figures and they've produced statistical analyses. Some have said that they think the death toll will be up to 186,000. Some have said it's far lower than that. Actually, that's no real use because they're secondary source. So we've always tried to stick to the primary source where we can. The other main source we've used is the social media of Hamas and Gazans themselves. And through that, we found people who are openly accepted to have been beaten to death by Hamas during the conflict. They're included on the list as having been killed by the RDF. And we found some really interesting stuff pushed out by Hamas on Facebook in earlier wars, where they are exhorting civilians in Gaza not to mention militant deaths, not to mention if one of their loved ones was Hamas, and to keep that as secret as possible. And so when people say in previous conflicts these Hamas lists have been reliable, that's not true either, because there was a clear pattern of Hamas suppressing fighter deaths throughout their recent conflicts with Israel.
One of the big scandals at the beginning of the war was the Al Ahli hospital, which immediately became a massive social media story, and not just, it actually became a major mainstream media story where the Hamas version of events was immediately taken at face value. I believe there was even a New York Times front page run with that. And it then turned out that it was actually an Islamic Jihad rocket that had misfired. How many of the deaths do you think are actually due to misfired rockets, friendly fire, and Hamas just basically self-regulating and policing the area under their control?
It's extremely tricky to say. Hamas make these lists incredibly difficult to interrogate. To start with, they don't declare any cause of death. and that makes verifying it incredibly challenging. They also mix up the lists. So rather than go from 1 to 50 for list 1 and then continue at 50 to 100 for list 2, they jumble the order of the names each time. They add in columns, take away columns, and it makes comparing the lists side by side extremely difficult. We can say with certainty that thousands of rockets have been fired from Gaza into Israel since the war started, and we know a significant proportion of those drop short. Again, we don't have the exact figures of that in a way that we can verify, but these will have almost certainly caused civilian casualties. We also know that the natural death rate before the war was 514 people in Gaza a month died of natural causes. And that clearly will have
514
a month.
Of natural causes.
514 a month.
So of old age.
Of old age, of disease, of illness. And that gives us a total of 6,000 potentially have died since the start of the war. And again, we found clear proof of people who died of natural causes being on those lists. So there could be as many as 6,000 people on those fatality lists attributed to the IDF who simply died of natural causes. It's also worth noting that probably the number of overall people in Gaza has risen since the start of the war. We've seen clear reports that there's a birth rate of over 5,000 a month, which puts us somewhere around the 60,000 mark of babies born in Gaza since the start of the war, which is more than even the number of people that Hamas claim have been killed. So particularly when it comes to genocide, actually, if the number of people in Gaza has increased, that very much is not destroying in whole or in part any kind of group in Gaza whatsoever.
How much of the destruction in Gaza do you think is actually necessary to root out Hamas? How much of it is truly taking out a building because that building is serving as a base? Surely not every single house in Gaza is a base for Hamas, right?
No, wrong. The exact manner in which Hamas fights is from building to building. They use the tunnels as a maneuver corridor. So they'll maneuver down the tunnel underground, they'll pop up, shoot at the IDF and then disappear again. And of course, that window then to strike those people shooting at the IDF is extremely small. And I'm not seeing any tactics they use that certainly we in the British Army or the American Army wouldn't use. The other factor to consider is these tunnels. Almost every house in certain parts of Gaza has a tunnel attached. And because Hamas have looked at how the IDF operated in Gaza City and in Khan Yunis, certainly in Rafah, they've started booby-trapping the tunnel entrances that are in every other house. And quite understandably, rather than risk their engineers and risk their soldiers to try and defuse those bombs, which are remote detonated attached to a camera, they detonate the building instead. So yes, that might seem extremely stark, but it's absolutely what I'd have done were I in their shoes.
From your personal combat experience, how difficult is it to differentiate a fighter from a civilian? How easy is it to make a mistake in urban warfare? I know that you fought obviously in Helmand and it was a rural area, but again, when you were fighting the Taliban, the Taliban wasn't in uniforms. This was a militia of sorts, a terror organization, a terror army. How hard was it in combat situations that you yourself have been in to differentiate the two?
It can be exceptionally nuanced, and Hamas and the Taliban actually use fairly similar tactics where we talked about the maneuver tunnels and how they'll move around underground, then pop up into a house, or they'll come out into the street, across the road, where there will be weapons pre-positioned. So until they're about to take a shot at you, they won't be carrying a weapon. And that makes them very hard to target. You have to, what we call PID, positively identify an enemy before you can legally open fire. So you might be divining an offensive intent, or you might be divining an active threat to you. But either way, you need to have something that says, I think that person is an enemy before you open fire. Now, clearly, if an enemy is in civilian clothing and is moving from house to house with no weapon, that makes deciding who is an enemy and who isn't exceptionally difficult. And it's inevitable that mistakes will happen at that point. I saw it happen in Afghanistan, and I don't know for a fact, but I'm still certain that it happened in Gaza with the IDF, because that is the nature of war. It's chaotic, it's challenging, it's extremely terrifying, and you're making life or death snap-second decisions, and mistakes happen in those kinds of circumstances.
Can you tell us about the situation that you yourself saw personally?
Yes, I know of a soldier who shot a man carrying a broom. He was a farmer in a field. He was carrying a broom. The soldier saw it, mistook it for a rifle in poor lighting, and shot and killed what we can only assume is an innocent farmer. An absolute tragedy. All we could do was compensate his family financially, but it still meant that we felt pretty dreadful for the next weeks, months, years. Nobody in a moral army, be that the British, the American, or the Israeli, goes to war to kill innocent civilians. That's not why we do it. And when that happens, it stays with you for a long time.
Do you think that there's any morality in the fight that Hamas is fighting?
I'm not convinced that they've approached this in a moral way, in any way, shape or form. I don't think that you can declare war by going on a rape, torture and murder and mutilation rampage and then claim subsequently that there's anything moral to what you're doing. I think you lose the moral high ground the moment that you start targeting civilians, as they did on 7th of October. In terms of the mismatch between the two forces, there's nothing in international humanitarian law that says war has to be a fair fight. And actually, it's vastly better for your own side if you do have the mismatch the IDF has. And that was really Hamas's mistake, in the sense that they started a fight with someone who massively outgunned them. And now Israel has been backed into a corner where they had no real choice but to respond. If we think of their options, they could have done nothing, which was clearly not acceptable. They could have done some sort of limited raid where they simply just decapitated what Hamas they could, but that would have been exceptionally difficult because they're all in the tunnels and probably wouldn't have achieved any strategic aims of making Israel more safe. Or they could do what they've done. So they didn't have a huge amount of choice. And Hamas have forced them into that. I think they thought they would be able to get them to stop through international pressure. That didn't work either. And now they are, unfortunately, reaping the whirlwind of their decisions. And poor innocent Gazans are the ones caught in the middle and are the ones suffering the most.
Andrew, one of the things that the IDF and the IDF PR machine tries to really highlight is the very low civilian to combatant ratio. From your analysis of these reports on the death tolls, what have you found about the combatant to civilian death ratio?
Yeah, our analysis broadly supports that, particularly if the 17 to 20,000 is correct. Even by Hamas's numbers, that's still bouncing around 1-to-1, slightly above that. If we take the civilian deaths by natural causes into account, it's even below 1-to-1. But we can't say any of that decisively. What's really important to note, though, is that this is very similar to the proportionality question. It actually doesn't matter what the ratio is. What matters is how those civilians died. Were they legitimately, legally collateral damage in an airstrike, or were they targeted? Because actually, even if you've got a 1 to 0.5 ratio, if you've deliberately targeted those civilians, it's still illegal. So it's completely irrelevant what the ratio is. So what really matters is that the IDF are following a proper humanitarian law compliant targeting process and rules of engagement on the ground. And from everything I've seen from the time I've spent with the IDF, both in back offices, in brigade and divisional headquarters, and on the ground in Gaza, I'm convinced that they are doing that.